Did you know Canada is quietly reworking the map of its security and alliances in a way we haven't seen since the early 1990s? Here's a straight truth to snap you awake. In the last 2 years, Ottawa has been forced to ask a question no one expected. Do we keep buying military hardware tied to Washington, even if that keeps us locked into a single supplier, or do we buy from a European partner that offers jobs, tech transfer, and a path to more independence? That question has turned into a political moment that could reshape Canada's role on the world stage. Saab, the Swedish defense company, formally offered Canada a package in January that includes dozens of Gripen fighters and airborne early warning systems, a bid framed not just in planes, but in factories and thousands of jobs. That offer is now part of a national debate about whether Canada should move away from an almost automatic alignment with the United States when it comes to defense procurement. Stay with me, because I'm about to uncover exactly why this decision could shake Canada's alliances, its economy, and its role on the world stage like never before. For decades, Canada has been used to buying its fighters as part of the same industrial orbit as the U.S. The Future Fighter program goes back years, and Ottawa planned to acquire 88 advanced jets. But the process is being frayed by politics, by industrial pitches from other suppliers, and by a wider strategic question. Is Canada hurt by being too dependent on one partner for the machines that defend its skies? The discussion is not academic. It matters for sovereignty, for jobs in Canadian factories, and for how Canada weighs in on global crises. Pause. Think about the stakes for a second. A fighter decision is not only about jets. It is about what Canada will sound like when it speaks at an international table. It is about whether Ottawa will lean harder toward the policies of Washington, or whether it will carve a path that sometimes diverges, sometimes challenges, and sometimes leads a different coalition. That's the core of the biggest political shift since 1993. Not a single vote, but a change in where Canada places its bets. Let's be blunt. The U.S. is pushing hard to protect its defense industrial base. American diplomats and industry leaders remind Ottawa what continental defense looks like and why interoperability matters. But there is a counter-argument that keeps growing louder. Buying from a different supplier could spread risk, build domestic industry, and give Canada more leverage in foreign policy decisions. The idea is simple. If you make it here, you have a deeper say. Recent reporting even shows Ottawa is considering a split fleet or a smaller F-35 buy while evaluating alternatives. That's a big change. If you think this is only about procurement, you're missing the larger move. This is part of a broader shift in which middle powers like Canada are reacting to what they see as sudden U.S. unilateralism and unpredictable policy moves. Europe, too, has been nudged into action by political shifts in Washington. Leaders there are talking about industrial and military independence in ways they didn't 10 years ago. That means Canada's realignment has a larger context. The post-World War II architecture is under stress. Alliances are being reassessed, and countries are hedging. Reuters and major analysts picked up on how Europe is responding to U.S. policy swings. That's the backdrop Ottawa is operating in. Now I'm going to walk you through how this plays out in the political arena. Stay with me, because I'll show why some in Ottawa call the moment the biggest political shift since 1993, and why others say that's an overreach. Either way, this debate is reshaping Canada. First, jobs. Saab's pitch to Ottawa was built around industrial benefits. The company tied its offer to thousands of potential Canadian jobs and local production, a bargaining chip that suddenly lands in the middle of a contested political space. For a country where manufacturing and aerospace communities are vocal, that's a direct appeal to both labor and local MPS. When a foreign bidder pairs military hardware with promised work for Canadians, it changes the conversation from pure capability to economic security. Saab's offer to localize production was explicitly presented as a job and technology package. That is not a small detail in Canadian politics. It's a vote mover in regions with a lot to gain. Second, interoperability and defense partnerships. Critics say buying anything other than the F-35 risks awkward frictions in NORAD and continental air defense. The U.S. ambassador has publicly warned about the implications of a smaller F-35 buy or a mixed fleet for the Continental Defense Pact. That warning lands hard in Ottawa, especially among those who prioritize seamless cooperation with the U.S. Yet the counter is that NATO has more than one platform, and that interoperability is not the same as dependency. European NATO members routinely operate different systems while sharing data and missions. If Canada invests in systems that offer modern data links and sustainment arrangements, it can remain interoperable while diversifying suppliers, and that may give Ottawa political breathing room when it disagrees with Washington on policy. Third, the foreign policy dimension. You've likely seen headlines about deep tensions over the Israel-Gaza crisis and how different democracies have reacted. Canada's leader publicly criticized aspects of Israel's conduct in Gaza back in late 2023, using unusually plain language about civilian suffering, which sparked sharp reactions from Israeli leaders. That moment showed Canada was willing to break from the script of automatic alignment on certain issues and to speak bluntly about humanitarian consequences. At the same time, Ottawa has continued to juggle support for Israel's right to defend itself and calls for adherence to international law. Those tensions show how foreign policy choices at home feed into the procurement debate. If Canada wants to be less predictable in how it votes and speaks, some argue it should avoid being locked into procurement and industrial ecosystems that tilt it toward Washington's line. And here's something you might not expect. Geopolitics is showing up in the Arctic in dramatic ways. The push and pull over Greenland, including revived American interest in the territory, has alarmed Canada's northern communities and its allies. The idea that Washington might push for more direct control or influence over Arctic territories raised fresh questions in Ottawa about who Canada sides with when Arctic security is at stake. Those anxieties strengthen the argument for greater strategic independence. If a U.S. administration signals it might take unorthodox steps around the Arctic, Canada sees real consequences at home, from Indigenous communities to NORAD patrol routes. Recent reporting documents renewed American interest in Greenland and the diplomatic fallout it created in Europe and the Arctic itself. That is a live issue in Ottawa's strategic calculus. Now, the story isn't that Canada hates the U.S., it's that Ottawa is asking whether deep automatic alignment on military buying and on some foreign policy reflexes still serves Canadian interests in a murkier world. The push for diversification is driven by practical goals: jobs, technology transfer, supply chain resilience, and strategic autonomy when Washington takes an extreme turn. This is an argument many European governments are having too, though on a larger scale. Let me put a face on the debate. Imagine a community in Ontario or Quebec where aerospace engineers and factory workers hear that a foreign bidder will locate production there. Suddenly, MPs from those regions have a constituency-level reason to press Ottawa to keep options open. Now imagine an opposite voice, a defense analyst in Ottawa who warns that split fleets cost more and complicate logistics. Those voices collide in Parliament and in public. That clash is not new, but the stakes feel new because the global context has changed. You should also hear another angle. Canadians worry about over-reliance on any single country for critical tech and supply lines. Look at recent global trade reports. Canada's trade mix is changing, and Ottawa has publicly pushed to diversify trade and build resilience in the face of shifting U.S. policy. If your economy and your kit come from one partner, your foreign policy leans that way in a practical sense. Buying a European fighter with local work means Canada could pursue policy choices that are more independent without immediate industrial consequences. That's a political payoff that resonates widely. Now let's address the hard part. Critics scream that any move away from U.S.-made jet buys is a betrayal of the Continental Defense Pact. They say the price of divergence is lowered security. That is not an empty threat. It is a real discussion about how NORAD would adapt if Canada scaled back an F-35 buy or opted for a mixed fleet. But the debate is not binary. NATO neighbors do this all the time. They operate different fighters and still cooperate. The technical work to keep radar, data links, and command systems talking to each other is complex, but it's feasible. And if Canada presses for industrial offsets, sovereign sustainment, and technology transfer, those benefits can be weighed against additional integration costs. The political calculus is about balancing sovereignty, jobs, and defense readiness. There's momentum here beyond procurement. Public opinion in Canada has been tested by international events in ways that make voters care about who Ottawa sides with and how Canada behaves. When Canadian leaders speak about atrocities or civilian casualties, voters notice. When Washington shifts policy in dramatic ways, European capitals react, and Canada watches and recalculates. That's why opinion research and foreign policy briefs show Canada is thinking in a more multipolar direction, even if the full shift will take years. Let's get into detail. Point 1. Saab's offer. It is not just a glossy brochure. The Swedish bid includes a package with Gripen fighters and Sweden's GlobalEye airborne radar platforms, plus a pledge to invest in Canadian production and supply chains. The company framed its proposal as a job-creating industrial program and proposed deep technology transfer. That kind of industrial offer has clear political power in Ottawa, especially among MPS, whose ridings would get the contracts. When a bid directly links defense procurement to long-term domestic employment, it becomes a domestic economic argument as much as a foreign policy decision. Point 2. The F-35 and the politics around it. Canada originally planned for a fleet of 88 F-35s as the long-term replacement for CF-18S. That plan has been revisited as politics, cost, and industrial demands have shifted. In public forums and parliamentary records, the future fighter competition has been repeatedly described as open and ongoing, but industry and political pressure have made the path forward murkier. If Ottawa chooses a smaller F-35 buy or a mixed fleet, the shape of Canada's defense industrial policy will be different, and that change sparks debate about long-term costs and benefits. Point 3. NATO, Europe, and U.S. unpredictability. Since 2024 and into 2025 and 2026, Europe has shown signs of urgency in its own defense plans. That urgency is not just reactionary, it's also strategic, driven by the sense that Europe cannot rely on automatic U.S. leadership for every crisis. Analysts and leaders in Europe have called for more autonomous industrial capacity. When Europe frees itself from the idea that Washington sets the entire agenda, it creates a space where Canada can cooperate more with European industry and partners without being seen as abandoning its Atlantic ties. That strategic environment matters because Ottawa does not want to be boxed into a position where its only practical path is the same as Washington's. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like the video and consider subscribing. Your support allows us to keep bringing detailed global coverage. Now, back to the topic. Let's touch on the tough moral arguments that heat up this whole debate. Some observers accuse the U.S. of backing policies in various conflicts that others see as violations of international law. Others point to the long-standing American tendency to prioritize its own strategic and commercial interests. Canada's blunt comments about civilian deaths in Gaza signaled that Ottawa was willing to call out allied partners, or at least to foreground humanitarian concerns, in a way that surprised some observers. That tone feeds a domestic political message. Canada will speak up, and if it chooses to speak up more often, Ottawa may want procurement and industrial policy that don't automatically penalize it for doing so. In short, foreign policy courage requires industrial room to maneuver. Now let's talk about money. Defense procurement is a huge contract stream, billions of dollars over decades. When a bidder promises local production, the political calculus changes in ways that affect unemployment, regional development, and local supply chains. That is why procurement becomes a domestic politics story as much as a foreign policy one. A promise of thousands of jobs in manufacturing and long-term maintenance can sway voters and MPs in critical ridings, and politicians know that. Saab's own material and reporting from Canadian outlets show the company pitching tens of thousands of labor hours and domestic work if Canada signs on. That's an argument that resonates in Ottawa. Let's step back and look at what this means for Canada's identity on the world stage. For decades, Canada's international posture has been built on middle power diplomacy, multilateral engagement, rule of law emphasis, and a reputation for balancing relations. If Ottawa starts to buy more from Europe and to speak more independently on major global crises, that posture shifts. It doesn't mean Canada abandons the U.S., it means Ottawa is trying to design a policy toolkit that does not force a straight-line answer every time Washington moves. That nuance is critical for anyone who thinks this is a sudden rupture. It's not an overnight divorce, it's a deliberate effort to widen the set of options Canada can credibly choose from. Opponents of a shift warn that divergent procurement creates higher life cycle costs, tougher logistics, and potentially strained continental defense integration. They also say the political cost of alienating the U.S. could be high if Canada appears to reject American industry at a time of geopolitical friction. Those are real concerns, and they deserve sober answers. Planners must calculate training, parts, maintenance, and the interoperability work to make a mixed fleet function. No one is pretending the technical work is trivial, but the political reward, more independent choices, domestic jobs, and a different voice on global crises is what appeals to many in Ottawa. Whatever decision Ottawa makes, it will not end the debate. If Canada picks Gripen or a split fleet, the U.S. will respond. If Canada confirms a large F-35 buy, critics will say Ottawa sold out an opportunity to build domestic capacity. The next few months and years will test whether Canada's political shift is a one-time headline or a lasting realignment. So, what should you watch for next? Watch cabinet statements on the fighter competition and for formal procurement decisions. Watch parliamentary questions and committee hearings about industrial offsets and domestic contracts. Watch how Ottawa frames its votes on international issues, whether Canada continues to speak bluntly about civilian suffering or whether it falls back into traditional rhetorical alignments. And finally, watch how Canadian industry reacts. If major supply agreements are signed, you'll see immediate local reactions from unions and local politicians. Those are the signals that will tell you whether this is a long-term shift or a temporary negotiation tactic. This is about power, but also about trust. Middle powers like Canada must decide who they can rely on in a crisis, and they must also decide how much of their economy they want tied to a single partner. Those are political choices, and they play out in the everyday language of jobs, factories, and commitments. When Saab promises jobs and technology transfer, that becomes a story about voters and livelihoods. When Washington presses for alignment, that becomes a story about alliances and shared defense. Canada's choice affects more than its Air Force. It affects how Ottawa will vote, speak, and partner in the decades ahead. To wrap up, this moment is the biggest political shift since 1993, not because of an election result, but because it asks a fundamental question about Canadian independence. Will Canada keep its security and industrial policy tightly integrated with the U.S.? Or will Ottawa use procurement, jobs, and industrial policy to open a new lane for Canadian foreign policy? That choice will shape the country's voice in crises, its domestic economy, and how it stands up for values it says it holds dear. Watch the fighter competition, and you'll watch the future of Canadian strategy unfold in real time. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives on global politics. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an update. And I want to hear from you. Do you think Canada should stick close to the U.S., or is it time for more independent moves? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start the conversation.